The ring was still on her finger when they told her it belonged to them now. It had been her mother's ring. A thin band of gold with a single pearl set in the center, small enough that most people never noticed it. Honoria had worn it since the day her mother died, and she had never once taken it off, not even when she bathed, not even when she slept. It had left a faint pale line on her finger, the way things do when they've been part of you long enough. Her uncle's solicitor had come on a Tuesday. He had set his leather case on the table in the front parlor without asking permission, and he had laid out the documents with the careful movements of a man who has delivered bad news so many times that he has stopped feeling it. The estate was entailed. The debts were real. There was a cousin, a distant one, male, whom Honoria had met twice in her life and remembered only as someone who laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny. And the personal effects, she had asked, because she needed to understand exactly how much was being taken. The solicitor had looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity. The inventory will need to include all items of value within the house. She had looked down at her hand. This ring was my mother's. It came with her from her family. It was never part of this estate. He had said he would make a note of it. She had known, even then, what that meant. She left the house 2 weeks later with one trunk, the clothes on her back, and the ring still on her finger, because she had decided, very quietly, that they would have to take it from her by force. No one had tried. She supposed even her cousin had enough shame left in him for that. She had nowhere particular to go. That was the truth of it, though she had spent most of those 2 weeks constructing a plan that felt, from the outside, like somewhere particular. She had written to a woman she knew only through correspondence, a Mrs. Yarrow, who ran a small household registry in the city and placed women in domestic positions. Honoria had written to her under her mother's maiden name, Whitmore, not Ashcroft, not the name anyone would recognize. She had not known, when she wrote that letter, that Mrs. Yarrow had a placement waiting that had already refused 3 applicants. The household was in the country, 3 hours north by rail, and then another hour by hired carriage along roads that grew steadily less maintained as the distance from the station increased. The position was for a lady's companion, to the widowed mother of a duke, Mrs. Yarrow said, though the mother had died some months before, and the Duke had not yet bothered to update the posting. What he actually needed, it seemed, was someone to manage his correspondence and keep his house from descending entirely into organized chaos. He had a housekeeper, an elderly woman, named Mrs. Patton, who knew where everything was and refused to tell anyone. He had a cook. He had a groundskeeper who did not come inside, and a footman who did not go outside, and an arrangement between them that had apparently lasted 15 years without incident. What he did not have was anyone who could read Latin, organize an archive, or write a letter that did not sound like it had been composed by a man who found words inconvenient. Mrs. Yarrow had seen Honoria's letter and thought of it immediately. Honoria had taken the position without asking too many questions, which was the first time in her life she had done such a thing, and which she attributed entirely to necessity. She arrived at Draven Hall on a Thursday in October, when the light was already going, and the trees had lost most of their leaves, and the whole place had the look of something that had decided, some years ago, to stop trying to appear welcoming. The housekeeper met her at the door. Mrs. Patton was perhaps 70, perhaps older, with the kind of face that had settled into its expression so long ago that surprise no longer had anywhere to land on it. She looked at Honoria the way one looks at a piece of furniture being delivered, determining where it will go, whether it will fit, whether the inconvenience of its arrival will ultimately be worth it. "Miss Whitmore," she said. Not a question. Yes, His Grace is not in. He will be back Friday evening or Saturday morning, depending on the roads. She stepped back to allow Honoria inside. "I'll show you to your rooms." Dinner is at 7. You'll eat with the upper staff until His Grace decides otherwise." Honoria followed her through an entrance hall that was considerably larger than anything a house in this condition ought to have. The ceiling was high, and the plasterwork was elaborate, and one section of it, near the east window, had been patched with something that did not quite match. Someone had put a great deal of effort into this house. Once. The effort had stopped, and the house remembered it. Her rooms were on the second floor, at the end of a corridor that turned once. They were clean. The window faced north, which meant no afternoon light, but it also meant she could see the edge of the woods and, if she leaned slightly, the roofline of what appeared to be a much older structure behind the main house, a folly, or perhaps a chapel. She stood at the window for a moment after Mrs. Patton left, her trunk still closed on the floor behind her, and she thought about the fact that she had grown up in a house not unlike this one, had known every corridor and every creaking board and every face that worked within its walls, and that all of it was gone now, passed to someone who laughed too loudly and would probably sell the library within the year. She unpacked. She went down to dinner. She ate with Mrs. Patton and the footman, whose name was Garvey and who was younger than she'd expected, and who spent the meal in a state of careful neutrality that suggested he had learned, in this household, that opinions were best kept private. No one asked where she had come from. She had not expected them to. People who needed positions did not always need them for simple reasons, and households like this one knew better than to press. She spent Friday in the library. It was not technically her responsibility yet. She had not met the Duke, had not been formally engaged, had not been given any specific instructions, but the library was the room at the end of the east corridor, and its door had been left open, and when she passed it on her way to find breakfast, she had looked inside and seen the state of it and stopped. It was not a disaster. That would have been easier to walk away from. It was something worse, a library that had once been exceptional, organized by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and then abandoned mid-process. There were books stacked on the floor that should have been shelved. There were boxes of correspondence that had been opened and sorted into piles that had since lost their logic. There was a map on the reading table that had been weighted at 3 corners with whatever had been close at hand. A paperweight, a candlestick, an object she couldn't immediately identify, and at the 4th corner with nothing, so that it had curled slightly and was in danger of rolling up entirely. She had weighted the 4th corner with a volume of Virgil and started on the correspondence before she thought to question whether she should. She worked. Through the morning, at some point Mrs. Patton appeared in the doorway, looked at her, looked at the room, and left without saying anything. Garvey brought tea at 11. No one told her to stop. By the time she heard the carriage in the drive, it was late afternoon on Saturday, and she had been in the library for the better part of 2 days and had made enough progress that she could now see the surface of the secondary reading table, which she suspected had not been visible since sometime the previous spring. She heard footsteps in the entrance hall. She heard Mrs. Patton's voice, low and efficient. She heard another voice, male, brief, not unkind, but not interested in lengthy greetings, and then silence, and then footsteps on the stairs, and then nothing for a while. She went back to the correspondence. She did not meet the Duke until Sunday morning, when she came down early and found him already in the library. He was standing at the east window with a cup of something in his hand, looking out at the grounds, and he did not turn when she entered. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a few years more, with the kind of build that suggested he spent actual time outdoors rather than simply having opinions about it. His coat was good, but not new. His hair needed cutting. "You reorganized the Merton correspondence," he said, without turning. She stopped just inside the door. "I did. The original sorting had been done by date, but several of the letters referenced ongoing legal matters, so I reorganized by subject and cross-referenced the dates within each grouping. If that's not how you prefer it, I can. It's how I prefer it, he said. He turned then and looked at her the way people do when they are actually looking, not simply establishing that someone is present. You found the Alderton files. She had. A set of letters tucked inside a portfolio that had been misshelved with the household accounts. Old letters, some of them, 20 years old or more, written in a hand she didn't recognize and addressed to someone she couldn't immediately place. She had set them aside to ask about. I didn't read them, she said. They seemed personal. Something in his face shifted very slightly in a way she couldn't interpret. They are, he said. But you'll need to understand them eventually. They're part of what needs organizing. He set down his cup. You're Miss Whitmore. Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Yarrow said you came with recommendations. She did. She didn't say from whom. Honoria held his gaze. I asked her not to. The households I worked for previously were. There were reasons I preferred a fresh start. It was not entirely a lie. There had been no previous households, but there had certainly been reasons. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was filing something away, not drawing a conclusion, but noting a question for later. Very well, he said. I'll need you to begin on the legal correspondence by the end of the week. The solicitor will be here Thursday, and there are letters from the past 6 months he'll need to review. Mrs. Patton will tell you which ones. She said she understood. He picked up his cup and left the library, and she stood there for a moment in the quiet, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor, and she thought, he notices things. It was not a comfortable thought. She stayed. The weeks accumulated. She learned the rhythms of the house, when Mrs. Patton would appear and when she wouldn't, which rooms were kept cold by deliberate neglect and which were cold simply because of the windows, where the good light was in the morning versus the afternoon. She learned that the Duke worked in the evenings and was nearly impossible to locate during the afternoons, that he had opinions about the organization of his correspondence, that he had never articulated to anyone but which became clear the moment she got them wrong, that he read widely and remembered most of it, and that he had a habit, when he encountered something he found interesting in what he was reading, of leaving the book open, face down, on whatever surface was closest to hand, which drove her quietly mad because it damaged the spines. She had been there 6 weeks before she mentioned it. They were in the library, and she was cross-referencing a set of letters against the household records, and he was reading something she hadn't been able to see the cover of. And he set it down open on the arm of the chair, and she said before she could stop herself, "If you leave it like that, you'll crack the binding." He looked at the book. He looked at her. He picked it up and closed it around his thumb to keep the page. "You were about to say something else," he said. "I wasn't. You were. You stopped yourself." She had been. She had been about to say that her father had said exactly the same thing, almost exactly those words, in almost exactly this kind of room. She had not said it because it was not the sort of thing one said to one's employer, and also because she had been working very hard for 6 weeks not to think about her father. "I was only going to say that there are bookmarks in the second drawer," she said instead. He found this, apparently, slightly funny. Not enough to smile, quite, but enough that something around his eyes changed. He reached across to the drawer, took out a bookmark, and placed it in his book with a deliberateness that was just enough to be pointed. She went back to her cross-referencing. "The Alderton letters," he said, a few minutes later. "Have you looked at them yet?" She had. She had spent most of an evening with them, in her room, with the door closed and the lamp turned high, because she had recognized the name partway through the first letter and had needed to sit down. The Alderton letters were from her mother. Not her mother by the name she'd used after her marriage. Her mother by her maiden name, the name she had been born with. Alderton, from a family in Northumberland that Honoria had known little about because her mother had rarely spoken of it, had said only that she had been unhappy there and had been glad to leave it. But the letters were clearly hers. Honoria knew her handwriting the way she knew her own face. They were addressed to someone whose name appeared only as an initial. 23 letters spanning nearly a decade. They were not love letters, or not only love letters. They were the correspondence of two people who had known each other very well for a very long time, who had shared a kind of ongoing conversation about their lives and their children and their choices, and, in the later letters, their regrets. Honoria had read them 3 times before she allowed herself to think about what they meant. The person she had been corresponding with, had, in one of the later letters, been addressed in return in a brief postscript that Honoria's mother had evidently received and kept tucked inside the portfolio. The postscript was in a different hand, shorter, warmer in tone. It was signed R. Cosworth. She had looked up then at the ceiling of her room, at the familiar, unfamiliar dark of it, and she had understood where she was. Not the house she had known as a child, but the house where some part of her history had been living all along, without her knowledge, in a portfolio of letters on a misshelved shelf. R. Cosworth had been the Duke's mother. She went back to the library. "Yes," she said. "I've looked at them." He was watching her. He had been, she realized, watching her carefully for the past several minutes. In the same way he had watched her that first morning, not casually, but with the focused attention of someone waiting to see what a thing would do. "Your mother wrote them," he said. It was not a question. She went very still. "The handwriting," he said, not unkindly. "I've seen enough of your correspondence drafts by now. The formation of the letters is distinctive." He set his book down, properly, this time, with the bookmark in it, and turned to face her fully. "I've known since the 3rd week." She thought about a number of things to say, and none of them were adequate. What she finally said was, "You didn't ask." "No," he said. "I thought you'd tell me when you were ready, or when you'd found what you came looking for. I didn't come looking for anything. I didn't know the letters were here." "I know that too," he said. "But you found them and you stayed." She had. She had stayed, and she had kept working, and she had not said anything, and she had spent 3 weeks trying to understand why she was staying, now that she knew what she knew, now that she had read her mother's words in her mother's hand, and understood that her mother had been trying, in those letters, to tell someone she trusted that she was frightened, not of her husband, who had been a kind man, but of what happened to women whose husbands died, and whose brothers had sons, and whose daughters had no legal claim to anything. Her mother had been frightened of exactly what had happened, and she had written about it to someone who lived here, in this house, in this library, and that person had died, and the letters had sat in a misshelved portfolio for years, and no one had thought to look. "She knew this was coming," Honoria said. "My mother, she knew that when my father died, everything would go to my cousin. She wrote about it. She was trying to. I don't know what she was trying to do. I don't know if she thought your mother could help, or if she was just telling someone." "She was telling someone," he said. "My mother wrote back that she intended to make inquiries, to look into whether there was a case to be made." He paused. "She died before she could do it." Honoria looked at him. "You knew. I found those letters when I was settling my mother's estate. I knew there was a woman named Alderton who had written to her, and I knew that woman had a daughter, and I knew the daughter had lost her inheritance to a male cousin through a mechanism that my mother had believed, in her last years, was not entirely clean." He held her gaze. "Mrs. Yarrow did not send you here by coincidence, Miss Whitmore. Her real name, of course, was not Miss Whitmore." Ashcroft, she said. Miss Honoria Ashcroft, he said. Yes, I asked Mrs. Yarrow to watch for your name when your circumstances changed. I knew they would eventually. In tales like that one, and solicitors like that one, it was only a matter of time. She stood in the middle of the library in a house she had come to as a servant, and she felt, very suddenly, extremely tired. Not the tired of overwork, the tired of having held yourself in a shape that was not quite your own shape for a very long time. Why didn't you say anything, she said, when I arrived? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the grounds, a door opened and closed. One of the outbuildings, perhaps, the groundskeeper beginning his morning. The ordinary sounds of a house continuing. Because you had come here as Miss Whitmore, he said, and you had your reasons for that, and I thought it matters, that you be the one to decide when to set it down. She had not cried, not when the solicitor had come, not when she had left her house, not when she had read her mother's letters. She did not cry now, but she put her hand up to her mouth for a moment, briefly, the way one does when something arrives that was not expected, and there is no other gesture available for it. The ring was on her finger, the pearl, small and pale in the morning light. He looked at it, just for a moment, the same way he looked at everything, with that particular quality of attention that meant he would not forget it. My mother's solicitor, he said, is not the same as mine. Mine is considerably more tenacious, and he has been reviewing the Ashcroft entail for the past 4 months. There are questions about the process of the transfer that he believes are worth pursuing. He will be here Thursday. He paused. I thought you might want to be in the room. She looked at him, at this man she had worked beside for 6 weeks, who had known who she was from nearly the beginning and had said nothing, and had given her the library and the time and the quiet necessary to find it herself. Your Grace, she said. He shook his head, just slightly. Everett, he said. It was the first time she had heard his given name and spoken aloud in this house. She took her hand down from her mouth. She straightened her spine, the way her mother had taught her, the way she had been doing her whole life in rooms that should have been hers by right. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he said. Outside, the light was changing, the slow particular shift of an October morning deciding, finally, to become a day. Honoria turned back to the correspondence on the table, to the careful work of putting things in the order they should have always been in, and for the first time since she had arrived at Draven Hall, she felt the shape of herself settle back into something that fit.